It would be simplest to say that Sorrel would never have spoken her wish aloud if she had not believed she was dying. But then again, if the Alpha King had been the sort of man who could sleep a single night through in his own bed, he would never have been prowling the Moongarth at the black bottom of the night to hear it. So if a person laid the whole thing out fairly and weighed every piece of it in an honest hand, the fault was his, all of it, start to finish. Not that anyone would have dared tell him so. Sorrel had kept the Moongarth for 9 years, since she was 17, and Warden Osric had set the cold iron key in her palm and told her the shrine wanted a steady soul and a quiet mouth, and she had both. It was her work to tend the low white stones, to keep the moss cut and the basins full, and above all, to sit with the ones who came at the end, for that was what the Moongarth was for. When a wolf of the Furmark knew their road had run out, they came here on the last night left to them, and they knelt on the cold flags, and they spoke one wish up into the listening moon before they went. The old belief held that the moon gathered these final wishes the way a river gathers rain, and that nothing spoken here was ever truly wasted, even when no living ear was near enough to catch it. Sorrel had heard a great many final wishes. She had never once imagined she would kneel here to speak her own. The grey rot had come for her slowly, the way it always did. First the ache in the marrow, then the tiredness no sleep would touch, then the creeping, grey bruise along her forearm that spread a little wider each week. No matter what she pressed against it, she was a healer. She knew the shape of the thing better than anyone alive. She had counted her own weeks the way she had counted them for 100 others, gently and without argument, and she had made her peace with the number, or told herself she had. There was no one who would miss her long, that was the mercy in it. She supposed it was also the whole of the wound. So she waited for the low moon, when the shrine was said to listen closest, and she went out alone. The night was clear and bitterly cold. Frost had silvered every blade of the shrine grass, and the moon hung fat and near and terribly bright above the black line of the pines. So bright it threw her shadow long and thin across the stones. Sorrel knelt where the dying knelt. She folded her ruined arm against her chest, and because she believed with her whole heart that no one could hear her, no one in all the sleeping Furmark, she said the true thing at last. The thing she had never once let past her teeth in the daylight. I do not want to be brave about it, she told the moon, and her voice cracked on the first word, and she let it crack. I have been useful my whole life. I have been steady and quiet and good with my hands, and every soul in this keep has leaned on me, and not one of them has ever once looked at me and wanted only that I stay. I have never been wanted for no reason at all. She pressed the heel of her hand hard against her mouth and made herself finish it, because if she did not finish it now, she never would. That is my wish, she said. Not more years. Just to have been wanted, one time, as myself, before the end of me. That is all I ask. That is everything I have. The moon said nothing. Of course. The moon never did. For a long while, there was only her own breath smoking in the cold, and the small clean silence of the shrine, and the enormous indifferent light. Sorrel bowed her head. She had expected to feel foolish, and she did, and beneath the foolishness, she felt lighter, the way a long-held breath feels when it is finally let go. She would go back to the infirmary, now. She would tend her stores and her patients, through whatever weeks were left, and she would never speak of this again. And no one would ever know, except that she was not alone. She knew it the way a body knows a turn in the weather. A shift in the air behind her, a warmth where warmth had no business being. Every hair on her neck rose at once. Sorrel came up off the stones and turned with her heart slamming, one hand dropping to the small knife at her belt out of pure habit, and there, at the dark edge of the shrine where the pines swallowed the moonlight whole, a man stood watching her. He had been there the whole time. She understood it at once, with a plunging horror that stole the strength clean out of her knees. He had heard every word. He stepped forward out of the shadow of the trees, unhurried, and the moon found him, and Sorrel forgot how to breathe. She knew that face. Everyone in the Furmark knew that face. It was struck on the coins in the infirmary strongbox and hung in oil above the great hearth she passed every dawn. The painters had caught the dark hair and the hard, clean jaw, and had missed, every one of them, all the rest of him. The stillness, the pale gray eyes that held the moonlight and gave nothing back at all. The plain, heavy weight of a wolf who had never once in his life needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. Corvin, the Alpha King of the Furmark, standing in her shrine at the black bottom of the night, as though he had grown there out of the frost. "Your Majesty," Sorrel breathed, and dropped far too late into the deepest bow her shaking legs would hold. "Do not," the king said quietly. His voice was low and unhurried, and it went straight through the cold like a lit coal laid against the skin. He did not tell her to rise. He only looked at her, and the look went on a beat too long, and there was something behind it she could not read at all. Then he crossed the last of the frost between them, and stopped close enough that she had to lift her chin to hold his eyes. And he said the one thing that no soul who ever spoke a wish at the Moongarth was meant to hear. "I heard you," Corvin said, "every word of it." He tilted his head, and the faint and terrible ghost of something that was almost a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "And the moon," he said, very softly, "heard me hear it." The light on the shrine stones changed. Sorrow woke with the gray light of morning in her eyes, and the unshakable conviction that she had dreamed the whole impossible thing. She lay in her own narrow cot in the corner of the infirmary, tucked beneath her own rough blanket, which meant that someone had carried her in from the cold. The last clear thing she held was the shrine, the moon, and her own cracked voice speaking aloud a thing she would trade a year of her short life to unsay. After that came the king, stepping out of the dark, the strange shifting of the light on the stones, and then nothing at all. She had fainted like a maiden in a bad ballad. She pressed both palms over her eyes and wished the floor would open and take her. "She lives," said a voice. Sorrel parted 2 fingers. Calla stood over the cot with her arms folded and her mouth set in the hard flat line that Sorrel had learned, across 6 years of working beside her, to dread. Behind Calla hovered young Wick the errand boy, and behind Wick 2 of the day nurses, every one of them staring as though she had grown a second head in the night. "Go and stare at someone else," Sorrel croaked. No one moved. That more than anything frightened her. Calla and Wick traded a swift, grim look with a whole conversation folded up inside it, and Sorrel felt her stomach drop through the floorboards. "What?" she said. "Whatever it is, say it." "You truly do not remember," Calla said. It was not a question. "I remember more than enough to be ashamed of," Sorrel said, and hoped with everything in her that it was the whole of what there was. "I spoke my wish to no one at all. I fainted in the cold like a child, and one of you was kind enough to fetch me in. That is the sum of it." "It is really not," said Wick, and then, catching a look from Calla, went scarlet. Calla crouched to the level of the cot, the way Sorrel herself did with a patient about to be told a hard thing. "I do not know a soft way to lay this down," she said, "so I will lay it down plain. You were not alone at the shrine last night. The king was there in the pines, and he answered you." The word "answered" dropped into the quiet, like a stone into a still, black pool. Sorrel went cold all the way through. "No," she said, to the memory more than to Calla, and the memory came anyway, dried up whole. "I heard you, every word of it, and the moon heard me hear it." The light. The impossible changing of the light that she had told herself was only a swoon coming on a wish spoken at the Moongarth on the low moon, witnessed and answered by another living soul, was not a prayer. It was an oath. Every wolf in the Furmark learned it at the knee, a moon-sworn bond, older than the crown itself, and no priest and no king and no power beneath the sky could cut one loose once it had set. "I am oath-bound," Sorrel said, and did not know her own voice. "To the king, to the king," Calla agreed, grim as a graveside. Sorrel sat up so fast the room tilted. She was a dying healer, with gray creeping up her arm, and no name worth the speaking, and by every law of the shrine, she was now bound, soul against soul, to the Alpha King of the entire realm. And then the truly cold thought arrived, the one that made all the rest look kind. They will say I did it on purpose. She watched it land on Calla's face in the same breath. Of course they would say it. Who kept the Moongarth? Who knew its every law and stone and season, better than any soul drawing breath? The healer. The quiet, steady, useful healer, who knew exactly which night the moon was said to listen closest, and who had somehow contrived to have the king of all the Furmark wander into her shrine at the 1 hour her wish could catch and hold him fast. Moon snaring. The old word ran, the snaring of an alpha into a bond he had never chosen. It was the blackest crime a keeper of a shrine could do, and the Furmark had a rope for it. I did not, Sorrel whispered. Kala, I swear it on the stones. I never knew he stood there. I know that, Kala said, jaw tight, but it is not me. You will have to make believe it. The door at the far end of the infirmary banged open hard enough to set the jars ringing on their shelves. A messenger stood framed in it, breathless, his cap crushed in both hands. Sorrel, he said, the warden wants you. Now. This very moment. Wick's hopeful young face folded quietly shut. A summons from Warden Osric. At this hour, in that flat, cold tone. Sorrel got up. She dressed with hands that would not stay steady. She went, because there was nothing else to do. And the whole long walk toward the tower, she rehearsed a defense. She did not believe herself, because Osric was the nearest thing to a father she had ever been given. And if even he should look at her the way the day nurses had, she could not make herself finish the thought. She never reached the tower. She was halfway across the frozen yard when the great horn on the gatehouse sounded, one long climbing note that stopped every soul in the keep dead where they stood. Sorrel's head came up. That horn carried one meaning alone, an arrival of the crown. And no one had cleared it, no one had run ahead to cry it through the yard, which meant it had gone clean over the warden's own head. And there was exactly one wolf in all the Furmark who could reach over the head of the warden of the watch. Footsteps came across the yard behind her, one set, easy, certain, coming her way and no other. The king had not summoned her after all. The king had come himself. The king crossed the yard, and the whole frozen world seemed to lean toward him as he came. Sorrel felt it before she had fully turned the air, drawing tight around a true alpha, her own tired wolf, lifting its head beneath her skin for the first time in weeks. In the dark of the shrine, hooded by night, he had almost let her forget what he was. Here in the raw gray morning, with the whole keep watching, he let no one forget anything. He filled the yard the way weather fills a valley. And though she had knelt beside dying men and steadied the hands of the highborn without once flinching, Sorrel found she could not hold his pale eyes for longer than a breath. Behind him, spilling out of the gatehouse, came Warden Osric at a hard stride. His broad face gone the color of old ash. "Your Majesty," he said, and there was a thread of true fear under the courtesy. "Whatever tale has reached you, I beg you let me answer for it. My keeper was at her shrine last night on shrine business, and if there has been some accident of the moon, then it is mine to explain, and mine to set right quietly." The king did not so much as glance at him. He was looking at Sorrel. And then, in front of the warden and the messenger and the 24 souls frozen across the yard with their breath held, the Alpha King of the Furmark smiled at her, warm and easy and utterly certain, and said, "There she is, my moon-sworn." The yard made a sound like a held breath breaking. Sorrel's mind went white. Moon-sworn, he had said it aloud, claimed it, before witnesses, as though it were the gladdest and plainest fact in the realm. Not moon-snared, not a crime. A bond freely spoken and freely answered, which no law could touch, and which no soul present would ever now dare to name a crime, because the king himself had stood in a frozen yard and called it his own. "Your Majesty," Osric tried once more. Lo, you cannot mean to. I mean exactly what I say, Corvin said pleasantly, and still did not turn to him. I heard my keeper speak her wish. I answered it of my own will, gladly, with the moon for my witness. He tilted his head, and his eyes moved over Sorrel with a slow, deliberate attention that heated her face to the roots of her hair. Does that trouble you, Warden? Sorrel could see plainly that it did, but there was no answer a wolf could make to that and keep his tongue, and so Osric bowed his ash-gray face and said nothing. And Sorrel understood, dimly, through her own reeling, that she had just been lifted clear of the gallows by the one hand in the realm that could do it, and she had not the faintest notion why, for it was a lie. Not the bond was real, she could feel it. Now, that she knew, to look, a thin, warm thread strung taut behind her ribs that had not been there the day before, but his gladness was the lie. She had heard 10,000 true things spoken in that shrine, and knew the sound of them, and there had been no gladness in the king when he stepped from the pines. There had been something watchful and cold and counting. He had answered her wish on purpose. He had bound himself to a dying stranger on purpose. And a wolf did not do such a thing gladly, he did it because it bought him something. The question was, what? Might I have my keeper to myself a moment? The king said. It was not truly a question. Osric bowed and withdrew, and the watching servants scattered like startled birds, and then impossibly, Sorrel stood alone with the Alpha King in the middle of the yard, the cold biting straight through her thin healer's smock. Your Majesty, she said, low and fast, I do not know what game this is, but you should not have done it. You have shackled the crown to a dead woman. I have weeks, perhaps fewer. She lifted her ruined arm a little, the gray plain in the morning light. When I go, you will be a widowed king oath-bound to a corpse. And for what? Undo it. Say I snared you after all. Let them hang me and be free of the whole business. It would be cleaner for you. Something flickered behind the pale gray eyes, quick and gone. You are very grim in the mornings, he observed. I am very dying in the mornings, she said, before she could stop the words, and to her horror, the corner of his mouth twitched. Then we had best not waste them, Corvin said. He stepped closer and dropped his voice so that it reached her and no one else, and all the easy warmth went out of it, and what was left was quiet and hard and real. Listen to me, keeper. A wish answered on the low moon does not simply sit and wait to be honored. It sets, or it sours. He let that land. If the bond between us is not sealed true by the next turn of the moon, 28 nights from the last, then it turns on the one who spoke the wish, and it burns the life clean out of her. He looked at her arm, at the gray creeping over it. You are not dying of the rot alone now, Sorrel. You are dying of me as well. And I am the only soul living who can stop it. The thread behind her ribs pulled tight and cold. Then his court face slid smoothly back into its place, the warm and careless mask, and he stepped away and lifted his voice for the yard to hear. I will send for you tonight, he said lightly. Wear something warm against the cold. And then he turned and walked away across the frost, unhurried, a king with all the time in the world, and left Sorrel standing alone, with a bond she had never asked for, a clock she could not stop, and the cold sure knowledge that the man who now held her life in his hand had not told her one true thing about why. He sent for her at the 8th bell, and Sorrel went to the king's table like a woman walking out to her own hanging. The room was small and warm and private, a fire banked high, a single long window black with night. Corvin rose when she came in, which no king had any business doing for a healer. She sat the way she sat at a deathbed, careful, watching the hands. You have not touched a thing, he observed, when the servants had gone and the pheasant on her plate had gone cold. I am waiting to learn why I am here, Sorrel said. To eat, said the king. No, she said. You do not throw a keep into an uproar and call a dying stranger your moon-sworn because you wanted company at supper. You want something. I have watched men want things my whole life, and none are subtle about it at the end. So say it plainly, what do you want from me? For a moment he only regarded her, chin propped on one hand. You are not what I was told to expect, he said softly. And what were you told? A quiet mouth? The warden's own words, when I asked him after the keeper of the Moongarth. He tilted his head. He forgot to mention that the quiet one bites. The mention of Osric set a small, cold stone in her chest, though she could not have said why. She put it aside. Then let me guess, and tell me where I stray. Kings do not walk their own Moongarths alone, at the low moon with no guard and no torch. You went there looking for something, or hiding from it. And when a broken healer handed you a bond you could use, you closed your hand on it. Because a moon-sworn keeper is a woman you can keep at your side and never explain why. Go on, Corvin said. He had gone very still. I cannot, she admitted. That is as far as the road runs. But here is the thing I came to say, since you wasted good pheasant getting me to it. Your people are dying, your majesty. Not in war, not in famine. In my infirmary quietly, one at a time, of a wasting no healer in the Firmark can name or turn back, and it is spreading. I have counted 11 this winter, 11, in a keep that buried 2 such deaths in all the 10 years before. And no soul above the infirmary door has once asked me why. The lazy charm did not fall away so much as sharpen. The way still water sharpens when a hawk's shadow crosses it. Show me, he said. Sorrel blinked. What? Show me, the king said again, and rose, and there was nothing careless left in him at all. You say my people are dying, and no one above your door has asked. I am above your door. Show me the records. Tonight, she had meant to shame him. She had not for a moment expected to be believed, so she showed him. The infirmary was hushed, only the breathing of the sick and one night nurse, who went white at the sight of the king in the ward. Sorrel walked him down the cots. Here, a cooper's wife with the grey to her elbow. Here, a boy of 9 who could not lift his head from the pillow. Corvin crouched at the child's cot and asked his name, and how it had begun, and listened to the small, tired answer as though the whole realm hung upon it. Then he asked for her records, and she gave over the battered ledger, where she kept her dead, and watched him read when his thumbs stopped partway down a page. She said, before she could stop herself, there, you see it. He looked up. She had come nearer than she meant to, close enough that their shoulders nearly met over the page. See what? They are not scattered. She set her fingertip beneath the names. Every one of them drew their winter stores from the east cellar. Every single one. The keep has 3 cellars, your majesty. Only the east has buried its people this year. Her voice had dropped without her leave. Whatever this is, it is not weather, and it is not ill luck. For a long moment, Corvin did not move. Then he closed the ledger, very gently, as though it were a wounded thing. And who holds the keys to the east cellar? He asked. His voice had gone quiet and level, and it was the levelness that frightened her, for it was the same he had worn calling her his moon-sworn in the yard. The warden of the watch, she said slowly. Osric. Something passed behind his eyes, and was gone. Then, take what your sick need from any cellar in this keep, he said, straightening, and answer for it to no one living but me. He was still looking at the ledger. If a wasting is crawling out of that storehouse keeper, I want it known before another child cannot lift his head. Quietly, she agreed, and did not know she had chosen a side until she heard herself say it. They crossed the physic garden on the way back, the short path to her still room, between the black beds of nightshade and foxglove and the low stone wall. The moon had gone behind cloud. Sorrel could have walked that path blind, which was why, 3 steps in, some old animal part of her stopped dead. A wrongness in the dark, a shape against the wall, the wind did not move. Down, she said, and shoved the king of the Firmark bodily into the foxglove. The crossbow quarrel passed through the air where his throat had been and buried itself in the doorpost, with a sound like a fist on wood. Then they came out of the dark all at once. 3 of them, blades low, faces bound in black, Sorrel had no sword, and had never wanted one. What she had was a healer's satchel, and a healer's terrible knowledge of exactly where a body comes undone. She met the first as he closed, caught his wrist the way she caught a thrashing patient, and drew her lancet across the inside of it. He shrieked and dropped his blade, because a hand will not hold what its cords no longer answer. The second she took with a fistful of still-room lime flung into his eyes, and while he clawed at his face, she put her knee where a knee does the most lasting harm and left him folded on the stones. The third went past her, straight for the king. She did not think. She threw herself into its path, and the blade meant for Corvin's heart opened her forearm instead. A long, bright line of fire, straight across the gray. She cried out, but she was already inside the man's guard with her lancet, and this time she did not aim only to wound. A nightbird called from beyond the wall. It was not a nightbird. The two still standing broke off at once. Not scrambling, not panicking, falling back together in good order, the way trained men fall back, and then the garden was empty and silent, and Sorrel knelt among the crushed foxglove with her own blood running hot to her fingertips. Corvin rose from the flattened flowers, unhurried. He looked at the empty dark, he looked at the quarrel quivering in the doorpost, and then he looked at her, kneeling and bleeding in his defense, and he did not look surprised. That was the thing that turned her cold, through the pain of the arm. He did not look surprised at all. "You knew," she said. Her voice did not sound like her own. "You walked into that garden knowing." And the whisper that ran the barracks a month past, "Your hunting horse come home to the yard with a cut girth and an empty saddle," passed off as a careless groom. This is not the first, is it? Someone is trying to kill you, and you have, let the whole keep believe, you are only a careless king who wanders his shrine alone at night. For half a breath, something real showed through, old and tired and afraid. "You are bleeding," he said gently, and reached for her ruined arm. "Let me see to that." She pulled it out of his hands. The fortnight that followed belonged to a single question. What was the king hiding? It was the only sane response to a man who had been shot at among his own foxgloves and had asked, afterward, only to bandage her arm. Someone wanted Corvin dead. She knew it, now past any doubt, so she did the thing she was good at. She watched. She tended her sick, and tracked her east cellar dead, and watched the king, and the king, maddeningly, would not be watched. She would set a careful question, and he would answer it with a softer one. She would press him on the men in the garden, and he would ask instead after her arm, and tell her the gray was already fading from her wrist, and she would glance down and find it was true, and lose her whole thread. For that was the other matter, the one she could not explain, and did not like. Near him, she was not dying. She had felt it first. The morning after the garden, waking without the marrow-deep ache that had been her one constant for a season. She told herself it was good sleep and strong tea. But then he came the next day to ask after the boy of 9, and she felt the thin bright thread behind her ribs draw warm the instant he crossed the threshold, and the ache lifted off her like a lid off a pot, and she understood. The bond, as it strengthened toward its ceiling, was holding the rot at bay. The very thing set to kill her by the low moon was, for now, the only thing keeping her upright. It was an unbearable bargain. The man was poison and cure in one skin, and she could not decide which she resented the more. Worse, the longer she watched him for danger, the more she simply watched him. The way he folded into the crooked chair, by her still-room fire as though he had sat there all his life, the way lamplight ran down the line of his throat when he tipped his head to laugh at a thing she had not meant to be funny. He took to coming late, when the ward had gone quiet, with no papers, and no question a page could not have carried. One bitter night on the east wall, he brought her a cup of spiced milk, and when his fingers brushed hers around it, the thread lit up to her shoulder and she nearly dropped the cup into the dark. "You have gone quiet," he said, watching her over his own. "I am thinking," she said. She was not thinking. She was looking at his mouth, and she caught herself at it, and was furious, and only looked the harder. He knew. That was the unbearable part. He would watch her with those pale eyes, and let her stew, and say nothing. A man who had already won, and was in no hurry to gather it in. She lay awake after the late watches, with the thread humming under her ribs, her mind going where daylight forbade it, despising herself for it and going there all the same. It broke late in the still room. The fire low, the drying herbs whispering overhead, the two of them alone. He had come and sat and asked her nothing, offered no scheme, nothing she could file the visit under. Only him in the lamplight, watching her hands work. And a thing in her that had held through far worse than this, quietly gave way. "Why do you keep coming here?" she said. It came out raw, and her pestle stilled. "Every night you sit in my still room, and will not say what you are after and will not leave, and I cannot do this." She set the pestle down. "I have spent my whole life not reaching for things, your majesty, because I learned young what becomes of a woman like me who reaches. And now I have a clock in my chest and a handful of weeks, and you come and sit by my fire and make me forget both. I cannot afford you. Stop making me forget that I cannot afford you." "Afford me?" Corvin said low, not teasing now. "And what is it you think you cannot afford?" "Do not," she said. "You have known for days. I think you have enjoyed the knowing." He rose from the crooked chair. He came round the bench slowly, the way a person crosses to something that might bolt, and stopped close enough that the warmth of him reached her through the cold of the room. "Then afford nothing," he said. "Ask for nothing. Only tell me to go, and I am gone, and I will not trouble your fire again." His voice dropped to almost nothing. Or, "Do not tell me to go." Sorrel had spent her whole careful life not reaching. She reached. She fisted her hand in his collar and pulled him down and kissed him, and every guarded thing in her went white and silent at once. His breath left him in a rush against her mouth. Then his hand slid into her hair and he kissed her back, warm and certain and unhurried, and there was no yard watching, and no oath to answer to, and no clock, only the low fire, and the swinging herbs, and the sudden whole enormous fact of him. And through the thread-drawn wire tight between them, she felt it break over her like water through a failing dam. His wanting, plain and helpless, and aimed at her. No scheme behind it and no use, only her, only this. Sorrel had been wanted for her steady hands her whole life. She had never once stood in the path of a man's plain want, for no reason but herself, and it undid her where nothing else could. She laid her palm flat against his chest and felt his heart going hard beneath it, and knew, past every mask he owned, exactly how little of this was performance. Not a scheme, not a use. Only a man who wanted her, plainly and for herself, and she found she wanted him back. It was the most reckless thing Sorrel had ever done in a lifetime of care, to stop counting the cost and simply let herself be wanted. And beneath it all, so quiet she could almost pretend she had not felt it, the thread between them pulled taut and began at last to set. There would be no unmaking it now. Sorrel had stood at the edge of 100 feasts with a satchel on her hip, waiting for someone to drink themselves into needing her. She had never once been a guest at one. Now she stood in borrowed moon-gray silk at the high moon feast, feeling as though she were a costume cut for a woman she was not. The hall blazed with 1,000 candles. At the high table sat the envoys of the Verne, the grim northern pack. Corvin had spent a hard year courting toward alliance, their young heir watching the room over the rim of a cup with cool measuring eyes. A wrong word tonight, Sorrel had gathered, and the alliance died, and the northern border died with it. The king moved among them and made it all look like nothing. Then he found her across the room and smiled, slow and private. The smile he had given her at dawn when she woke in his bed with the gray gone quiet in her arm. The knot beneath her ribs loosened. "You look like a thing the moon sent for," he murmured, arriving at her side. "I look like I am wearing a tent someone embroidered," she said. And he laughed and steered her out through a side arch onto a colonnade, where the music thinned and the cold night air came up off the dark gardens. For a while, neither of them spoke. "You are tired," she said, watching him. Not a question. In a fortnight of learning the shape of his laughter, she had learned this too, the small tells of the worn smile against the true one. He glanced at her, caught out. "It is a long night." "That is not what I said." He looked out through the arch at the turning dancers. For a moment she thought he would deflect again, the way he deflected everything. Then something in him seemed to set down a weight it was tired of carrying. "I was crowned at 19, he said quietly. A boy with no notion of what he was doing and a hall full of wolves waiting to see him falter. So I learned a trick. I learned to be a mirror, to show each of them the king they most needed to see, so that not one of them ever looked hard enough to find the boy who did not know." He turned the cup slowly in his hand. "I have held that mirror up so long, Sorrel, that some nights I cannot tell you what stands behind it, or whether anything does." "Corvin," she said. He met her eyes and she watched him brace the way a man braces for a blow he has decided to take standing. She reached up and laid her palm against the side of his face. His breath caught. The mirror cracked. "There is something behind it," she said quietly. "I have kept its company for a fortnight now," and she paused, because the saying of it frightened her, and she said it anyway. "I like him better than the mirror, far better." Something broke open behind the pale eyes. "Sorrel," he said, and her name came out of him, rough as torn cloth. Then he kissed her, and it was nothing like the still room. That had been hunger. This was fierce and grateful and half undone, and she leaned into it without thinking, into him, and the world turned quietly on its hinge. And the thread behind her ribs warming toward its seal for a fortnight came fully and blindingly awake. It was not the wanting, this time. She knew the wanting now. This was the man himself, pouring through the place where they touched, his whole guarded inside laid bare against her for one unbearable instant. Relief, like a breath held too long, and finally let go. Fear, old and deep and carefully kept, and beneath it all turned toward her, so tender it hurt to hold, a thing she had no armor against at all. She felt his heart the way she felt her own. The bond had woken, and it was real, and it was sealing, and there would be no calling it home again. Sorrel tore herself back with a gasp. Corvin's eyes were wide, his breath ragged. "You felt that," he said. "Sorrel, tell me you felt," and here was the whole trouble of her. She had felt it, all of it, the true unguarded whole of him, and it had shown her in a single stroke exactly how far she had already fallen and exactly how much there now was to lose. She was a woman with a clock in her chest who had spent a lifetime learning not to want what would be taken from her, and the terror of it reached her tongue before her heart could catch it. "That was not us," she heard herself say. "That was the bond. It makes us feel things that were never ours to feel. It is the oath, Corvin, doing what the oath does, nothing more." Corvin went very still. "The oath," he repeated. Something in his face turned down like a lamp. "Of course." He stepped back, and the warmth went careful and distant, the polished voice he kept for envoys and frightened lords sliding smoothly into place. The voice he had not used on her in 2 weeks. "You are right," he said. "Only the oath. Forgive me. They will be missing their moon sworn from the feast." He offered her his arm. It was perfectly correct. There was a whole cold country in it now that had not been there a minute before. And Sorrel took it, and hated herself, and could still feel the ghost of his heart beating against her own, and had no idea in the world how to tell him that of everything she had said beneath the moon, since this began, that was the one true lie. They went back into the light and the music, and Corvin was the mirror, again, flawless, and only Sorrel could feel the cold coming off him, through the thread she had lied to him about. She should have gone to her infirmary. Instead, she stayed at the wall, in her borrowed silk, and watched him work the room, because a healer learns to watch the things she is afraid of. And so she was watching when the servant came. He came smooth and unhurried through the crowd, with a silver tray and a single cup of wine dark as old blood, and made straight for the king, and something in sorrel came up off the floor of her stomach, snarling before her mind had caught the reason. She had spent a season with her nose over dying cups and grey powders, and under the oak and the fruit of that wine there was a thread of scent she knew far too well, the same faint bitterness that clung to every jar of tainted stores she had pulled from the east cellar. The grey road itself, distilled down from a slow winter's murder into a single swallow. Corvin's hand closed on the stem. "Do not," Sorrel said, and crossed the floor and struck the cup from his fingers. It shattered on the flags, and the dark wine ran out between the stones, and the whole colonnade end of the hall went silent, and the servant was already gone, melted back into the crowd as though he had never been. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Corvin laughed, easy and warm, a man whose moon-sworn had merely had too much sun and swept the moment shut before the vern could sharpen on it. But his hand, when it found the small of her back to steer her out, was not steady, and through the thread she felt it, past all his ease. The cold, hard lurch of a man who has just seen how close the blade came. He got her into a side passage and let the mirror fall. "That was the same," she said, low and shaking. "The wine. It was the grey red, your majesty, concentrated to a killing dose. The thing that has been wasting your people one slow spoonful at a time was just poured neat into your cup at your own feast. It is all one hand, the sick in my ward and the men in the garden, and that cup, one hand." "I know," Corvin said quietly. "You know." She stared at him. "Then we go to the vern, we go to the watch, we do nothing," he said and caught her by the shoulders. "Listen to me. There are envoys of the vern 20 steps from here, and a year of my work holding that border together by a thread. If it is cried through this keep tonight that the Alpha King was poisoned under his own roof while he feasted their heir, the vern will be gone by dawn and the border with them, and then it will not be 11 dead in a winter. It will be a war." He held her eyes. "I need your quiet mouth one more time, keeper. Trust me to handle this my way. Can you do that?" Every part of her that was a healer, trained to name the wound and drain it clean, said no. But she could still feel the ghost of his true heart from the colonnade, and she heard herself say, "All right, I promise." Relief went through him and through the thread both. He pressed his mouth briefly to her temple, grateful, and then the mirror slid back up, and he was gone into the hall, a king with everything in the world in hand. And Sorrel, who had promised, stood alone in the passage for exactly as long as it took her to stop believing herself. Then she followed him. She kept to the edges, the way she kept to the edges of a sick room, and watched him move through the feast, smiling, deflecting, and watched the moment he slipped a side door, and the smile dropped off his face like a dropped plate. She followed him down 2 flights into the cold stone gut of the keep, toward the warden's tower, and her stomach went with her, down and down. The door at the bottom clicked shut behind him. For a moment Sorrel stood in the dark of the stair and could not make her legs obey. Then she crossed to the door and opened it. Corvin stood behind Osric's own great desk. The drawers were open. He had a sheaf of the warden's private papers in one hand and a small stoppered vial of grey powder in the other, and spread beneath them on the desk, where the candlelight caught it, was a page in a careful hand that Sorrel could read even upside down and even across the room, because it was a list of names and the name written plainest at the top of it. Underlined twice was her own. He looked up and found her in the doorway, and for one long, airless moment, neither of them moved. "Sorrel," he said, very calm, very careful. "This is not what it looks like." Corvin never fumbled. He always had the answer before you had finished the question. But now he stood behind Osric's desk with her own name underlined twice beneath his hand, and he paused. "Say something," she begged him without a word. He set the papers down. "I have been building a case against the warden of the watch," he said. "Since before the low moon. The grey road is no sickness, Sorrel. It is a poison, slow and patient, salted into the east cellar stores across a whole winter. It thins the pack, it thins the loyal watch, It bleeds coin and grain and men quietly toward House Sarn, who have wanted my seat for 3 generations and have at last found a warden willing to sell it to them one dead child at a time. He lifted the vial of grey powder, and the men in the garden and the cup tonight carried his coin. It has been Osric from the first. The words would not resolve into sense. Osric, the man who had pulled her out of the wintered dirt at 13 and put a healer's satchel in her hands and told her she was worth something. No, she said. Osric would never. You do not know him. I know the keys to that cellar hang from his belt, Corvin said gently. I know his hand is on every contradictory order that has hidden the deaths. And I know, because I have watched a long while, that everything you believed about your careless fool of a king, that he was too idle to notice his pack rotting from the floor up, you were taught to believe, slowly, over years, by the one man in this keep who needed you never to look at him and always at me. She opened her mouth and nothing came, because she could hear it. Osric across 100 late winters, grinding his teeth over the stores, the vanished spears, the king too soft to see it. A king ought to know what rots in his own house, her own certainty, in her own mouth, his words first. She had carried her mentor's poison in her mouth for years, and never once tasted that it was not her own, and then the colder thing arrived, the one that made even that look kind. You needed someone close to him, she said, and did not know her own voice. Someone he trusted, someone he would never think to watch. She lifted her ruined arm, the gray plane in the candlelight. You went to the Moongarth that night, hunting away inside the one man you could not touch, and a dying fool knelt down and spoke a wish, and you heard whose ward she was before you heard a single word of what she wanted. She was shaking. Say I am wrong, Corvin, say it. He held her eyes and did not say it. She pressed the heel of her hand to her mouth. Of course, of course. Her one clean moment of being wanted, the one time in a whole gray useful life a soul had looked at her and answered her wish, and it had been a move on a board, a lever cut to exactly her shape. The ward of the traitor, the key that fit the one lock in a keep he could not otherwise pick. Not all of it, he said, low. He came round the desk, and she stepped back into the corridor, and he stopped at once. I will not pretend the oath did not begin as a way in. But it stopped being that, Sorrel, weeks ago, in a still room, and you know it, because you felt it on a colonnade tonight and called it a spell to keep from feeling it. Why did you not simply tell me? She said. If you knew what he was, why not haul him before the pack? You are the king, because being king does not make me safe, he said, and for the first time, the steadiness in him frayed. Osric holds the watch. He holds the loyalty of every soldier in this keep, and an old name and House Sarn behind him. If I had seized him on a suspicion, with no proof, one wolf could not argue away. There would have been blood on these stairs by morning and a war on the border by the next moon. He shook his head. Tyrants jail, whoever frightens them, and wonder at the knife 3 years on. I had to be certain. I could not move, until I had a thing not one soul alive could call a lie. It was a good answer. That was the worst of it. It was a good answer, and she hated it for being one. You should have told me, she said, her voice breaking. You watched me put my own body between you and a blade. You watched me bleed into the foxglove for you. And in all of it, you never once told me the truth of why I was there. He looked at her, and when the answer came, it was barely a breath. Because I did not think you would believe me, not against him, and I was right, was I not? Even now. It landed like a slap because it was not wrong, so she reached past it, the way you reach past a wound too deep to touch to the older one underneath. There, said the quiet voice that had always lived in her. You let yourself believe you could be wanted for yourself. Look what wanting you was actually for. Do not, she said, when his hand came up toward her face, the way it had on the colonnade. She struck the wall with her spine getting away from it, and he froze, the touch ungiven. Do not say it became real. Not when the only reason any of it exists is that I happen to be the traitor's ward. Sorrel, he said, please. Seal the oath yourself. Then, if you can, she said and did not look back. You are the king. You can do anything. She stepped out into the dark of the corridor and left him standing among the proof of everything, with her name underlined twice on the desk behind him, and the thread between their ribs pulled so tight and so cold, she thought it might cut her in two before the low moon ever got the chance. It was all a lie. She pressed the heels of both hands to her eyes, hard enough to see sparks. She had been a fool, and into the middle of that thought, out of the dark of the corridor, came the one voice in the world she had trusted longest. Sorrel. Osric stood 10 paces off, half in shadow, as though he had been waiting there. And before she could think better of it, she was moving toward him, because he had pulled her out of the winter dirt at 13 and made her into someone who could stand on her own 2 feet. And she was not standing very well just now. His broad hands came down on her shoulders. "What has happened?" he said. "You are white as bone." And because it hurt too much to hold, she let it fall out of her. "It was all a lie, Warden. The king never wanted me. He used me to get inside your papers. I was only a way in." Osric's ash-gray face softened. "I know," he said gently. "I hoped to spare you the knowing. I am sorry, girl." He had known. Then from the first, everyone had known but her. "But it is worse than you think," Osric said low, and his jaw went hard. "The wine at the feast, the poison in your ward all winter, it is his sorrel. The king's own hand. He has been culling the pack himself, thinning the wolves who might stand against him, frightening the Vern into an alliance they would never sign freely, and blaming it on a phantom in my cellar. And he bound you to himself for one reason only, to keep the one healer in this, keep who could read the poison too close to ever cry it aloud." Sorrel went very still, and there it was. She knew the shape of a true thing. She had heard 10,000 of them in her shrine, and she had felt the truest of all pour through the thread on a colonnade, the whole real guarded heart of a man who had crouched at a dying child's cot and asked his name. This was a thing built to fit her wound exactly, and things that fit a wound that neatly were made, not found. The grey rot came from the east cellar. She had traced it herself. The east cellar keys hung from Osric's own belt. The men in the garden had fallen back on a hunter's call, the call the watch used, the watch that answered to Osric. And no poisoner alive salts a slow death through a whole winter, and then hands the antidote a healer at his own side. It was Osric. It had always been Osric. And he was lying to her face in the dark, with his hands on her shoulders. And the man who had lied to her all along, it turned out, was the one who had never once told her a lie until now. Every instinct she owned reached for the truth of it. And every instinct she owned, she smothered, because Osric commanded every blade in this keep, and she was one healer in a corridor, and a truth spoken too soon is only a warning to the guilty. So she let her face crumple, which cost her nothing, because it wanted to. "What do we do?" she whispered. Osric's eyes sharpened with something that was almost tenderness, and was really only use. "We go to the Vern," he said before he can dress it up. "A king who would poison his own pack is unfit to sit, and there are good houses ready to steady the realm when he falls. House Sarn, chief among them." He drew her in against his side. "But it cannot come from me. I am only the old warden. They will call it a grab for his chair. It has to come from someone. The whole room will believe." His voice went soft, almost kind. "The king's own moonsworn. If you stand before the Vern and tell them you saw the poison in his hand, not a soul in that chamber will doubt a word." Sorrel made herself nod against his shoulder, slow, like a woman with nothing left. And underneath the nodding, cold and clear and steady as a surgeon's hand, she began to lay her trap inside his. They walked, and it was the longest walk of her life. She had to carry herself into that chamber and turn Osric's trap inside out, with nothing in her hands but her own word. And if she misjudged a single breath of it, the border went to war, and the man she loved went to the block, and she was not certain, even now, which of those she could least survive. The Vern had taken the East Council Room. all cold gray stone and colder gray faces. Their young heir sat at the head of the long table, chin on fist, watching. And Corvin was there, on his feet, by the window. And when Sorrel came in at Osric's shoulder, his whole face lit for half a heartbeat before he saw who she walked in beside, and the light went out of him like a snuffed candle. He thought she had come to bury him. "I am sorry," she told him, with no words at all. "I should have believed you." "Envoys of the Verne," Osric began, bowing his grey head. "It grieves me past speaking to bring this before you. But your alliance is being bought with a poison, and the hand that pours it wears a crown." He laid it out smooth as poured oil. The wasting and the pack. The cup at the feast. A king culling his own to frighten the north into terms. And then, the turn, the blade of it, you need not take an old warden's word. The king's own moon sworn stood witness. She has every reason on earth to shield the man she is bound to. He turned, and the whole cold room turned with him. To Sorrel, by the door. "Ask her, keeper. Tell their heir what you saw the king do." Every face in the chamber swung to her. The Verne heir, leaning in. Osric, certain of her already counting as win. And Corvin, who believed she had come to end him, and stood very straight to take it. Sorrel looked at the heir of the Verne. "I saw nothing of the sort," she said, "because none of it happened." The room drew tight as a bowstring. "The warden tells you the poison is the king's," she went on, before Osric's face had finished changing. "But I am the healer who traced it, and it came out of one storehouse in this keep, the east cellar, and the only keys to that cellar hang from the warden's own belt. He tells you the king poisons his pack to frighten you. But there have been 3 attempts on King Corvin's life this winter. One of them before your very envoys arrived, all by men who fell back on the watch call at the whistle, the warden's own watch. And tonight, at the feast, poison was poured into the king's cup, the same grey death that has been salted through his people all winter. I struck it from his hand myself." She lifted her chin. "You are asked to believe a king has been murdering himself. Search the warden's tower and the east cellar. Now, while he stands here and cannot reach them, and see whether you find the coin of House Sarn and a vial of grey powder, or whether you do not." "This is madness," Osric said, and his voice cracked down the middle. "She is distraught. The king has broken the poor creature's mind." "Then a search costs you nothing," said the Verne heir quietly, and lifted one hand to the guards along the wall, and Osric's grave old face came apart. The father who had pulled her from the dirt was gone, and what stood in his coat was only a cornered thing. He moved fast for a man his age, faster than any of them looked for, straight at her, and she saw the blade slide from his sleeve, half a breath before it reached her. "Sorrel." Corvin's voice, raw with terror, across the room. But this was the one thing in the whole night she truly knew how to do. She did not meet the blade with strength she did not have. She met it the way she had met the men in the garden. The way a healer meets a body. She caught the wrist as it came, turned it against the joint, the way a joint does not wish to go, and drew her lancet clean across the tendons on the inside of his arm. And his hand simply stopped answering him. The blade rang on the stone. And as he staggered, off balance and gasping, the stoppered vial in his breast pocket tumbled loose and shattered across the council table. And a fan of fine grey powder spread out, plain, across the pale wood in front of the envoys of the Verne. The grey rot in the warden's own coat spilled at last into the light. The guards had him before he found his feet. Sorrel stood over him with the lancet still in her hand, and her heart going like a hammer. "You taught me to read a body, and keep a quiet mouth." "Warden," she said low, "only for him, you should have remembered. I can do both." Then they hauled him up, and dragged him out, and it was done. The Verne heir went to their envoys, the alliance saved, the poison plain on the table for every northern eye to see. The guards took Osric down toward the old cells. And then, in the emptying chamber, it was only the 2 of them. Corvin had not moved. He was looking at her as though he had never seen her before. "You saved me," he said. Even after what I did to you, you still— I came to stop a traitor, Sorrel said flatly. That is all it was. The light in his face guttered. Sorrel, the oath. It is real. You felt it on the colonnade. I know that you did. It does not matter whether it is real, she said, and made her voice as cold as the stone. I stood up in that room because it was the truth, and because a poisoner had his keys on my dead. Not one breath of it was forgiveness. You made a lever of me, Corvin. You cut a bond to the exact shape of the traitor's ward and called it fate. A sealed oath does not unmake that. His hope drained out slowly, the way blood leaves a face. Sorrel, I love you, he said. I do not care how it began. That, she said, does not change what it was built for. And she turned and left him, standing alone in the cold gray chamber, with the poison still spread across the table between them, and did not let herself feel the thread scream until she was well down the corridor, and no one living could see her hand pressed to her chest. The low moon came and went, and Sorrel did not die. She had braced for it, the night the oath was meant to sour and burn the life out of her, and instead she woke to a still gray dawn with her breath easy and the ache gone quiet. The rot along her arm had stopped its crawl. She was healer enough to read why. The east cellar had been dug out to the bare stone. Every tainted jar burned. The slow poison that had been killing her all winter along with the rest, cut off at the root. And the oath, half sealed in one true moment on a colonnade and then clamped shut with all her strength, had held just enough to keep the residue at bay. She was not cured. She was not dying. She hung, like the bond itself, somewhere between. By the turn of the season, she was high physician of the Furmark, with the whole Pax healing under her hand, and the Moongarth restored beneath her, a seat that a year before she would not have dared to dream of standing near. She was good at it. She had always known she would be. The king had done all of it. The cellars cleaned, the watch made honest, the rot cut out of the keep by the roots, and the pack had begun slowly to love him for it. And he had spent the whole of that same season trying to win her back. The supplies came first. A month after the trial, she walked into her infirmary to find it stocked, as it had never once been stocked in 9 years. Every empty peg filled, every requisition she had begged for and never received, simply there, waiting. She sent no thanks. He tried the council next. She sat at the high table twice a week now, and he was always across it, and he would catch her eye, and his whole face would do something hopeful and undefended, and she would look back down at the tallies of the sick. Then came the letters. 2 and 3 a week, in his own hand, some short, some running down whole pages, some not about her at all, a posting, a dispute over pensions for the widowed watch, as though her honest word on it were still worth something to him. She did not answer one. By the 4th month, there were more than 40 of them in the locked drawer of her still room, unanswered and unburned, which told her more about herself than she cared to know. The bond did not help. Leave a bond open and it deepens. Keep it shut and it aches, and hers ached, a low patient warmth under her ribs that would not wither however hard she starved it. Calla told her to talk to the man. Wick, grown half ahead in the season, told her the king had fixed the back pay and written her how many letters now. By the 5th month even, they had given up gentleness. You are both miserable, Calla said, and the rest of us have to stand here and watch it. Sorrel set down her pen and said she had been made a lever once and was not queuing for a second turn, and that she was a good physician and would like to be left to it. Calla looked at her a long moment and did not believe a word. Then, one night in the 6th month, a letter came that was different from all the rest. Sorrel, it read, you have made yourself plain, and you have every right to it. I turned the truest thing either of us has ever had into a tool, and no number of letters unmakes, that you deserve to be left in peace, and so I will leave you in it. I will not write again. Be well, Corvin. She read it twice. This was the thing she had wanted from the first, so she could not understand why it sat in her chest, like a stone going down a well. He kept his word. No more letters, no more filled pegs left quietly in the night. When they passed in the corridors, he inclined his head, physician, even and courteous, never cold. Only done. This is what you wanted, she told herself, and did her work, and did it well. And every single night, the warm, patient thread under her ribs stayed exactly where it was, and would not fade, until the knock. Wick came into her still room, white to the lips, Calla at his shoulder, the same gray color, both of them wearing the faces of people who have made a very large mistake. "What?" Sorrel said slowly. "What have you done?" "He is gone," Calla said. "The king. Not in his chambers, not in the keep, not anywhere. No horse taken, no coin drawn, his sword still on its stand, and the room left neat and empty. The trackers had his trail off his chamber and lost it clean at the east postern, where it simply stopped, the way a trail stops when a man is being careful, or when a man is being carried. Sorrel was on her feet without deciding to be. There was one road left to find him, and she had known it from the instant Kea said the word gone. She pressed her hand to her chest, over the bond she had spent half a year trying to smother. It is only duty, she told herself. He is the king. Finding him is my work. It was not only that, and she knew it, and she opened the bond. Anyway, opening the bond after half a year of starving, it was like throwing a shutter wide in a gale. It hit her all at once. Sorrow first, deep and bottomless. The twin of the one she had carried under her own ribs for 6 months. Then a raw scald of something turned inward. An anger with nowhere to go but the self. And beneath it, loose and swimming and slow, his thoughts coming unmoored and drifting, the unmistakable heavy tide of a man who has been drinking, to drown exactly this, not carried then, not taken. Careful, the trackers had said, and they had been right and read it wrong. He had slipped his own keep on purpose, alone, on the low moon, and there was only one place in all the Furmark. A wrecked and grieving king would go on the low moon. Sorrel was running before she had finished the thought, out through the postern and up the frozen path, with the bond hauling her on like a rope drawn taut, past the black pines and into the moongarth, where the moon hung fat and near and terribly bright over the low white stones. And there, kneeling where the dying knelt, was the Alpha King of the Furmark, coatless in the cold, an empty bottle tipped over on the flags beside him, talking earnestly and at considerable length up into the indifferent moon. She stopped at the edge of the pines, in the dark, where he could not see her. Exactly where he had once stood. "I know how this is done," he was telling the moon, his voice gone loose at the edges. "I have watched her do it. You speak the true thing, the one you would never say by daylight, and you trust that even if no living soul hears it, it is not wasted." He laughed, low and bleak. "So, here is mine." He tipped his head back. "I have been a mirror since I was 19. I have shown every wolf in this realm the king they needed, and not one of them ever once looked behind it, and I told myself that was safety." His breath smoked in the cold. Then one plain, furious, dying healer looked straight through the glass on the very first night, and told me she liked the man behind it better. And I was so afraid of losing her, that I lied to keep her, and I lost her anyway, which is precisely what I deserved. Sorrel could not move, could not breathe. "I do not want more years," he said to the moon, and it split her clean down the middle, because they were her own words. Worn a season and turned inside out. "I do not want the crown, or the north, or any of it. I want the one soul who saw me to look at me like that again. That is my wish. That is the whole of it." He bowed his head. "And I know she cannot hear me, which is the only reason I can bear to say it." For a long moment there was only his breath and the enormous quiet light. Then Sorrel stepped out of the pines. He came around at the sound, unsteady, and saw her, and his ruined, miserable face cracked open into something so nakedly glad it was almost unbearable to look at. "Sorrel," he breathed. "I heard you," she said. Every word of it. And she crossed the frost to where he knelt, and stopped close enough that he had to tip his head back to hold her eyes, and gave him back the thing he had given her on this very ground half a year before. And the moon, she said softly, heard me hear it. Something moved through the bond between them, wide open now on both sides for the first time, and she felt the low ache of the rod loosen its grip on her arm as the thread pulled warm and whole. He felt it too. She watched him feel it. Then, ask me, he started, thick with drink and hope, reaching for her hand. Ask me, or let me ask you. I have forgotten which of us. You are drunk on a shrine floor, Corvin, she said. She caught him by the shoulders before he could tip into the stones, this great, warm, helpless weight of a king, and found she was not letting go. Ask me again, she said low, at the next low moon. Sober, in your right mind, as a man, and not a bottle, and not an oath. Speak your wish to me, and mean every word, and we will find out together what the moon does with it. His eyes were sliding, half shut. And you will answer, he said, hopeful and blurred. Ask, she said, and felt the corner of her own mouth pull upward for the first time in 6 months, and find out. In the end, it took him the better part of a season. He asked again at the next low moon, sober, kneeling on the same cold flags with his hands steady and his eyes clear, and Sorrel, who had spent a lifetime learning never to reach, made him ask a second time to be certain it was not the drink, or the shrine, or the pity of the moment. Then a third, because she found she liked the asking, he asked her across the high table. Until Kala threatened to hand in her resignation in writing, he asked her on the east wall with 2 cups of spiced milk going cold between his hands. He asked her badly, and he asked her beautifully, and once with so many flowers that the whole infirmary smelled like a spring funeral for a week, and every time Sorrel told him to ask again, until one perfectly ordinary morning, she looked at the man grinning hopefully at her over a shared breakfast, and said yes. And when she said it, the oath that had hung half-sealed under her ribs for a year, finally quietly, set, not to a lever, not to a scheme, to a thing chosen with both eyes open, in daylight, by a woman who was no longer dying of anything at all. The last of the gray faded from her arm within the moon. They were wed at the Moongarth, of course. There was nowhere else it could have been done. The whole pack came out for it, the boy of 9 among them, strong again, and taller by a hand, and the Vern sent their heir, with the alliance sealed in good faith at last, and the keep that had watched a plain healer bind their king by accident, now watched her bind him again on purpose, and cheered until the pines shook. Corvin wept during the vows. She had known that he would. She did not quite, though it was a near thing. And the bond gave her away regardless, and he laughed at her through his own tears until she stopped caring who saw. You spoke a wish here, he said, when it was done, his forehead against hers, that you thought no soul alive could hear, and I heard it, and I never left. He smiled. No, taking it back now. Why would I take it back? Said Sorrel, keeper of the Moongarth, high physician of the Furmark, moon-sworn and living, and wanted at last, for no reason under heaven but herself. I am the one who wished for you first, if you recall. Beneath this very moon. This thing you never meant to do, Corvin said. She kissed him, and for once, did not argue the point. And if you had asked the pack whose fault the whole impossible business was, the drunk king and the dying healer, and the traitor dragged out by his own spilled poison, they would have told you it began the night a woman knelt alone and spoke to the moon. But you and I know better. It began the night a sleepless king could not stay in his own bed, and went walking where he had no business walking, and heard a thing he was never meant to hear. So really, when you weigh it out fairly, the whole of it was his fault. Every last thread. He would not have argued either. He got exactly what he wished for.